Sloan walked into my house carrying a designer handbag that cost more than my household expenses for an entire year. And I knew right away that something was very wrong. She strolled in 23 minutes late for our Sunday family dinner, walking with that exaggerated, arrogant confidence she always used to mask her deep insecurities. My son, Derek, trailed closely behind her, carrying a last-minute grocery store dessert, his eyes firmly glued to the floor. I was at the dining table, serving the roast beef, just watching them in silence. At 65 years old, widowed, and with decades of experience working as a bank fraud investigator, I've learned one absolute truth. People will lie to your face, but their financial habits never do. Sloan sat down without a word of apology and immediately monopolized the conversation. She talked a mile a minute about her weekend getaway to Las Vegas, breathlessly name-dropping Fountain View suites, bottles of champagne that cost hundreds of dollars, and exclusive spa treatments. Derek just nodded weakly beside her, cutting his food without looking up. He had always been a passive man, easily molded by his wife's demands. As she talked, my mind started putting two and two together. Sloan worked part-time at a local home decor boutique, and Derek made a modest salary as an administrative assistant. The math simply didn't add up. I excused myself quietly, pretending I needed to grab more napkins from the kitchen. Walking past the entryway console, I glanced down at Sloan's open handbag. Peeking out from the edge of her wallet were the familiar designs of my 3 backup credit cards. The exact same emergency cards I kept tucked away in my desk drawer in the guest room where Sloan and Derek had slept during their last visit. I took a deep breath, feeling a wave of absolute ice-cold clarity wash over me. I wasn't going to cry, and I certainly wasn't going to make a scene. I walked back into the dining room, took my seat, and stared right at her, waiting for her little performance to end. I waited until Derek got up to use the restroom before making my move. I looked Sloan dead in the eye and, without raising my voice a single decibel, asked her exactly how she had funded a $32,000 luxury trip. Her smile froze for a fraction of a second before twisting into a smug smirk. She reached into her obscenely expensive bag, pulled out a fistful of crumpled receipts, and waved them right in my face. Then, she let out a shrill laugh that practically made my ears ring. "I maxed out your cards in Vegas," she sneered, leaning her elbows on my oak dining table. "What's a broke loser like you going to do about it? You just sit in this house counting pennies. I actually know how to live." There wasn't a shred of remorse in her voice. It was pure, cruel defiance. She mistook my usual quiet nature for weakness. She assumed that because I was her mother-in-law, an older woman, I would just swallow the debt and keep my mouth shut to avoid a family scandal. Derek walked back to the table right at that moment. He saw the receipts in her hand, looked over at me, went totally pale, and didn't say a single word to defend me. His silent complicity was the final answer I needed. I picked up my water glass, took a slow sip, and set it gently back on the tablecloth. "I'll be filing the fraud report," I said calmly. Sloan let out an even louder, uglier laugh. "Do what you want, crazy old lady. Nobody's gonna believe you." I didn't argue. I didn't yell. I simply stood up, cleared my plate and hers, and pointed toward the front door. "Dinner is over. You can leave now." Sloan rolled her eyes, grabbed her thousands of dollars bag, and marched out, followed closely by a mute Derek. The second the front door clicked shut, I didn't shed a single tear. I went straight to my computer. My family never really understood my career. To them, I was just a boring bureaucrat who shuffled paperwork all day. What they didn't realize was that before my partial retirement, I was a senior fraud investigator for the federal banking system. I still maintained my professional credentials and had direct access to high-tier security portals. I sat down in my dark office, the blue light of the monitor reflecting in my glasses. I didn't need to call a lawyer. I didn't draft any messy lawsuits. I just logged right into the internal security system. I located the 3 stolen cards and pulled up the pending charges: luxury hotels, high-end designer boutiques, exclusive steakhouses, $32,000 in total. With a few precise clicks, I flagged every single transaction as interstate fraud and identity theft, attaching the geolocation of Sloane's device and the point-of-sale data, because the charges were made by an unauthorized user across state lines. The bank's automated system immediately triggered a maximum-level security alert. The cards were locked down instantly, but I didn't stop there. I knew things were going to get ugly the next day, so I got ahead of the fallout. Derek and Sloane lived in a nice little condo I had purchased 10 years ago. It was fully in my name, and I paid the property taxes. I opened my phone, went to the HOA security app, and completely deactivated both of their electronic gate and door access codes. Next, I logged into my cellular provider and canceled the phone lines that were still under my family plan. I completely cut off their financial oxygen, and the whole process took me less than 20 minutes. I closed my laptop, brewed myself a hot cup of chamomile tea, and went to sleep. The wheels of justice were already turning, and I was going to get a good night's rest. At 8 o'clock the next morning, while I was peacefully watering the begonias in my backyard, reality finally caught up with Sloane. I knew it had happened because my landline started ringing off the hook. I didn't answer. I just poured myself a fresh cup of coffee and sat down to listen to the voicemails. Derek's voice was frantic, bordering on hysterical. He babbled that federal bank security agents had shown up at Sloane's boutique because the fraud crossed state lines and involved high-level, aggravated identity theft. The system wasn't treating it like a petty family dispute. She was actively being interrogated, and all of her personal bank accounts had been frozen pending investigation. I finished my coffee. It was time for Phase 2. I grabbed my keys and drove over to the condo where they lived, knowing Derek had likely rushed to his wife's side. I assumed the place would be empty. And I was right. I let myself in with my master key. I didn't break anything, and I didn't touch a single piece of their personal property. I just called a local locksmith. He arrived in 15 minutes, swapped out the front door lock, and handed me the new keys. Before leaving, I stuck a simple Post-it note on the refrigerator. Your month-to-month verbal lease is terminated. You have 5 days to coordinate moving your belongings. Communicate via text only. As I walked out of the building, I spotted Derek's car parked on the street. A car that, conveniently, was legally titled in my name. I pulled out the spare key I'd always kept, got in, and drove it straight back to my house, parking it safely inside my locked garage. No screaming, no messy confrontations. I had recovered my property in under 3 hours. Later that afternoon, my doorbell rang violently. I checked the security cameras and saw Derek standing on the porch all by himself, desperately pounding on the front door. He looked completely disheveled and was sweating through his shirt. I pressed the intercom button from the kitchen but kept the deadbolt locked. "Mom, please, open the door. You have to stop this," Derek begged, his voice cracking through the speaker. "Drop the charges. Sloane is facing serious federal trouble. Our accounts are frozen, our door codes don't work, and my car is gone. The car is in my garage. Derek." "It belongs to me," I replied, my voice cool and metallic over the intercom. "The credit cards were stolen, and the bank is doing its job. And the condo is mine, too." "We're your family," he yelled, slapping his hand against the wood. Family doesn't steal $32,000 to go partying in Vegas. And family doesn't laugh in the face of the person paying their bills. We have nowhere to go. We don't have any money. My son sobbed, falling back on the same emotional manipulation he had used his entire life. Years ago, hearing him cry would have broken my heart. Today, it just gave me a headache. That is not my problem. You both have jobs. Find a cheap motel. I will text you a window of time when you can come collect your clothes. If you ever bang on my door like this again, I'm calling neighborhood security. I let go of the intercom button. I stood perfectly still in the kitchen, listening as Derek lingered in silence for a few minutes before finally giving up. I heard his heavy footsteps crunching away on the gravel driveway. I didn't feel an ounce of guilt. All I felt was a profound, immense sense of liberation. I had drawn a hard line in the sand, and absolutely no one was going to cross it ever again. The next morning, I drove down to my local bank branch. The branch manager, an old colleague of mine named Greg, welcomed me into his office. We sat down with fresh coffees and started going through the paperwork. "Martha, the system locked everything down immediately," Greg explained, adjusting his glasses. "The internal fraud investigation is clear-cut. She signed the receipts with her own name while using your cards. The casinos and luxury stores in Vegas are already pulling their security footage. Since you reported it promptly, you have zero liability for the debt." "And what happens to that balance?" I asked, signing the final identity theft affidavit. "The bank is going to reverse the charges back to the merchants. Those Vegas hotels and boutiques are either going to come after her directly for the fraud, or the bank will demand payment with massive penalty interest. Either way, Sloan now has $32,000 of debt in her name, completely frozen assets, and a bank fraud record that will nuke her credit score for the next 10 years. I nodded, deeply satisfied with the efficiency of the system. Before I left, I had Greg permanently close any accounts where Derek was listed as a secondary beneficiary, and I transferred every dime of my assets into an individual trust. I was leaving zero loose ends. If Derek thought he was going to inherit a dime to bail out his wife's bad choices, he was in for a rude awakening. I walked out of the bank into the crisp morning air, feeling like a massive weight had just evaporated off my shoulders. Wednesday afternoon, I coordinated the return of Derek and Sloane's belongings with the precision of a financial audit. I didn't hand the stuff over to them personally. I had absolutely no intention of becoming the target of their temper tantrums. I hired a local moving company, paid the invoice up front, and let the crew into the condo. I sat on a stool at the kitchen island with a notepad, supervising every single move. I was crystal clear with the workers. They were only to pack clothes, toiletries, shoes, and personal documents. The solid oak furniture, the stainless steel appliances, the ceramic dishware, and even the high thread count bath towels stayed right where they were. I paid for all of it, and I had the receipts to prove it. It was almost poetic watching how Sloane's actual belongings fast fashion, half-used makeup palettes, and cheap trinkets fit into just a handful of standard cardboard boxes. For all her delusions of grandeur, her entire life didn't even fill half a small U-Haul truck. Once the movers finished, I rented a basic, bare-bones storage unit in an industrial park on the outskirts of town. It was secure, but cheap, and I only paid for the first month. I sat in my car and drafted a highly specific text to my son. "Derek, your belongings are at Northside Self-Storage, Unit 42. The padlock combination is your birth date. Rent is paid through the 30th of this month. Starting on the 1st, it is entirely your responsibility. Do not return to the condo." 5 minutes later, my phone lit up. It wasn't Derek. It was Sloane. She unleashed an absolute avalanche of text messages, firing them off one after another without pausing to breathe. It was a digital monument to her desperation, massive paragraphs stuffed with insults, aggressive all caps screaming, accusations that I was a cold, calculating monster, and empty threats that I would never, ever see my future grandchildren. I read the first two messages with a totally blank expression. I didn't feel the slightest urge to defend myself or explain how the real adult world worked. I just hit block contact. I did the same exact thing for Derek's number. If there was a genuine medical emergency, the hospital would know how to find me for any other crisis. My customer service window was permanently closed. That night, I brewed myself a cup of tea, settled into my favorite armchair, and opened a good book. The silence in my house was thick, clean, and absolutely wonderful. But I knew Sloane's bruised ego wouldn't let her stay quiet forever. 3 weeks went by in absolute tranquility, the kind of deep peace you only experience when you finally cut the dead weight out of your financial life. I had resumed my normal routine of visiting the organic market on Tuesday mornings, thoroughly enjoying the simple pleasure of picking out fresh ingredients without worrying if Derek was going to call and beg for money to cover his electric bill. I was standing in the produce section, testing the firmness of some ripe tomatoes, when the air around me seemed to instantly drop 10 degrees. I heard heavy, fast footsteps marching up right behind me. "You ruined my life, you evil bitch," a voice hissed, dripping with venom. I turned around slowly, not even dropping the tomato in my hand. It was Sloane. I almost didn't recognize her. Her hair was thrown up in a messy bun. She wasn't wearing her usual flawless makeup, and she was carrying a faded canvas tote bag instead of her precious designer purses. Her posture was completely aggressive, invading my personal space. With total calm, I casually pushed my shopping cart forward, putting a solid metal barrier between us. "No, Sloane," I replied, my voice as flat and cold as the supermarket tile. "You ruined your own life the second you decided my credit card was your personal slush fund. All I did was stop shielding you from reality." Her eyes welled up with angry tears, but there wasn't a drop of genuine sadness in them, just the bitter resentment of a thief who got caught. "Derek left me because of you," she spat, raising her voice so the people in the next aisle started turning their heads. "He couldn't handle the bank pressure and the debt. And now he's sleeping on his friend's couch. And I got fired because the fraud investigators showed up and talked to my store manager. I have nothing left. You really should have thought about that before blowing $32,000 that didn't belong to you in Vegas," I told her calmly, carefully placing my tomatoes onto the hanging scale. Actions have consequences. Welcome to the adult world. I turned my back and started walking toward the cash registers. Sloane followed right on my heels, breathing heavily, trying to use public humiliation as a weapon against me. "You're a horrible woman, a terrible mother who abandoned her own son," she screamed right in the middle of the main aisle. A dozen shoppers stopped dead in their tracks to watch the drama unfold. Any other woman might have shrunk away in embarrassment or started screaming back. Not me. I rolled up to the checkout lane, greeted the cashier with a warm, polite smile, and pulled out my wallet, while Sloane continued to throw a screaming temper tantrum behind me. I paid for my groceries in cash, grabbed my reusable bags, and walked out through the automatic sliding doors with perfect posture, leaving her standing there, screaming all by herself and completely humiliated next to the frozen foods, was the ultimate proof that she had absolutely no power over me anymore. The following months were an exercise in deep cleaning, not just financially, but emotionally. I sold the condo they had been living in. I took the profits from the sale, padded my retirement fund, and finally hired a professional landscaper to completely redesign my backyard. It was a project I had dreamed of doing for years, but always put off because I was busy bailing Derek out of trouble. I received a couple of letters in the mail from Derek trying to apologize, written in that shaky, pathetic handwriting he always used when he was building up to asking for cash. I skimmed them and tossed them into a filing cabinet. I never replied. I knew his remorse didn't come from a place of love. It came from the sheer panic of having to pay his own rent and cover his own bills for the very first time in his adult life. As for Sloane, my friend Greg at the bank eventually told me she had been forced to file for personal bankruptcy. Her accounts remained frozen, and she had taken a job at a fast food joint just to try and negotiate payment plans with her furious Vegas creditors. It was a brutal lesson, but an entirely necessary one. I didn't feel a sense of triumph, nor did I feel any malice. I just felt the quiet satisfaction of an equation that had finally been balanced. My home now smelled like fresh lavender and roasted coffee, completely free of the repressed, suffocating tension of those Sunday family dinners. It's Thursday morning, and the bright sunlight is pouring through my kitchen window. I'm sitting at the solid oak dining table, the exact same table where, almost a year ago, Sloane waved those stolen receipts in my face and laughed at me. Today, the table is covered in beautiful landscaping blueprints and colorful seed catalogs. At 65 years old, I finally realized that sometimes a mother's love means knowing exactly when to close the door and lock it. There isn't going to be some tearful, emotional family reunion in my future. There won't be hugs and apologies. Derek is going to have to learn how to be a man without my wallet acting as his permanent safety net. And Sloane is going to have to learn that the real world doesn't fund her Instagram fantasies. I take a slow sip of my black coffee. I can hear the birds singing out in my newly renovated backyard. The locks on my doors are brand new. My credit cards are perfectly safe, and my peace of mind is absolute. Sometimes, true justice doesn't require a courtroom, an expensive lawyer, or endless screaming matches. Sometimes, justice is simply realizing your own worth, making one timely phone call to the bank, changing a lock, and brewing yourself an excellent cup of coffee. Everything is exactly as it should be. Thinking back on everything that happened, I realized something deeply personal. For years, I truly believed that my duty as a mother and a mother-in-law was to cushion the blows of life for them, even if it meant swallowing my own discomfort and tolerating blatant disrespect. But I finally understood that enabling abuse isn't love. It's just a fear of conflict. Letting them go so they could face the brutal consequences of their own choices wasn't an act of revenge or cruelty. It was pure emotional survival. I learned that setting a hard boundary and closing a door might hurt for a brief moment, but it saves you from spending the rest of your life carrying a heavy burden that was never yours to bear. I no longer care about maintaining the illusion of the perfect family. Today, I simply choose my peace, and for the first time in my life, I don't feel a single ounce of guilt for it.